Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of my mini series about the subject of trauma. And today we are covering childhood trauma. Um, I would start really by saying that most of our trauma is rooted in childhood. Um, Sometimes we don't know that it's rooted in childhood because sometimes we forget, sometimes we dismiss it as being just the way it was, and we don't actually allow ourselves to process the feelings around what actually happened to us. Uh, there are various things that can happen to us as children that can really affect us, and sometimes we don't really understand fully the impact of what that can be. Um, I have my book out, Critical Parenting Reframed, which talks a lot about some of the narratives we get as children, and that can be the cause of an awful lot of our trauma in adulthood and actually affecting the way that we live our lives in adulthood and can lead to some very, very unhealthy choices going forward. So if we think, for example, about the teacher who tells you that you're going to fail at life, you're not going to amount to anything. You're not going to be very much, because you're the odd one out, the misfit, the disruptive one in the class, the one who's in the bottom of the class for all the subjects. You're not as brainy as the others. You're not as sporty as the others. There's a whole narrative around that that can really affect how you move forward in your life. And to hear those kind of narratives as a child is really hard because we don't have the emotional capacity as children to actually challenge what we hear. We don't have a way to say, hang on a minute, I don't think that's true, because our emotional reasoning skills haven't developed fully as children. So we're very much in this position where we just take as true everything that somebody says to us. So in childhood, you may have narratives from a teacher, narratives from a parent. Not intentionally, I'm sure. There's no parent, hopefully, that would intentionally scar a child. But it's very easily done. Even if you don't intend it, it's very, very easy to do. Just by some of the things you're told, sit down, be quiet, um, sit down and shut up. You're gonna grow up thinking that you don't deserve to have a voice. Um, at your age, grow up. So instantly, you're not allowed to be a child. So now you're having to adapt. So in therapy, I talk a lot about the adapted child. And the adapted child is that child who has to adapt to the circumstances in which they find themselves. They have to adapt to the environment in which they find themselves as a child. So they're not allowed to be a free child. They're not allowed to sing and hum and laugh and jump in muddy puddles because the critical parent will be there saying, how dare you get your trousers muddy? Oh my God, and instantly you're going to be reprimanded. So you're having to adapt your behavior to satisfy the adults around you to make sure that you don't upset them so you can keep the peace. And from that comes a narrative of people pleasing that can stay with you for the rest of your life. You can be frightened to raise your head above the parapet for fear of being reprimanded. So you become this very compliant people pleaser. You don't want to upset anyone. You can't bear actually for anyone around you to be upset. And you feel like it's your duty to go and make them happy. You've got to make them happy. Never mind you. Let's make them happy. And this narrative of people pleasing can really affect us, can stop us from going for promotions at work because, oh, I'll let my best friend go for that because she deserves it more than me. Um, Being in a relationship that's very, very unhealthy, and trying to keep your partner happy, even though actually it probably is quite impossible to keep them happy. Sometimes you might have a very unhealthy relationship with quite a controlling partner, and nothing you do is going to be good enough for that person, but you're still in that cycle of people pleasing. So you try and you try and you try until you get absolutely exhausted. So these childhood narratives can become very strong and they can affect you all the way through your life. And then there's the things that we see as children. And some of the things we see as children, we should not be seeing, you know. And actually now, it's much worse because now we have social media, we have TikTok, we have YouTube, we have children being exposed to a whole range of things that they should not be seeing. And it's very hard as a parent to police 24/7 what your child is watching. And some of that stuff is going to really be potentially very harmful going forward. Um, it's not just social media, it's stuff within the home sometimes, it's stuff around peers at school. Children are exposed to sometimes alcohol within the house, um, addictions within the house. Parents may be drinking a lot, parents may be on drugs. Children are growing up feeling very neglected because of that. They're feeling a lot of blame and shame because of that. They're feeling like perhaps it's their fault that mummy drinks. Again, the people pleasing, how can I make it better for mummy? Trying all the time to fix things that as children we just should not be even exposed to, never mind fixing. We shouldn't even be exposed to this stuff, right? We're kids. Um, Harmful sexual behaviours in the house is another subject that I hear a lot in therapy. Children have been exposed to watching or seeing their parents engaged in sexual activity or hearing their parents engaged in this kind of activity, sometimes even being abused as children sexually by parents, leading to a whole range of trauma around emotional connection and what that might look like in a healthy relationship, because they've never had that. They don't know what it looks like in a healthy relationship. They've only seen it in a very unhealthy way. Um, so all of these things can have huge, huge impacts. School bullying, another example of something that can really traumatize us. I remember as a child being told um, that, I was common because my dad smoked. And that made me common because he was somebody who smoked and it was very dirty. And I took that narrative and I felt for a long time that I was worth nothing. I was just the village idiot, these very cruel things that children say to one another. We really need to be thinking about the language we use when we talk to each other, the way that we frame, questions and responses, the way that we frame our comments, because one comment like that can really do some damage. Um, Teachers who called me a loner, who told me that I couldn't interact with people. Look at me now talking to you today on a podcast. They were wrong, but it took me 40 years to set that down. It was hugely damaging for me. Um, we just have to be careful, really, with how we speak. Physical bullying at school, emotional bullying at school, all of these things can really have an impact on our futures. Even getting into drugs, dabbling in drugs, I've had clients who are very young who have dabbled in drugs at school, and although they're not on drugs now, they're still traumatized by it because they've had very bad acid trips or things like that that have led them into PTSD and extreme paranoia that they now can't get rid of. And that's the after effect of that cycle of where they were on the drug and what it's done, chemically to their brain. So very long lasting effects again, just from a few months of dabbling. For what reason? To fit in, to belong, to impress somebody. Why were they doing that? So again, it's looking at where that behavior came from, where that addictive behavior stemmed from. And that is actually the subject of the next episode, which is going to talk about addictive behaviors in a bit more detail. So this particular podcast here is just a little snapshot for you around childhood trauma, what it might look like, different kinds of childhood trauma, and actually the long lasting impact of that if we don't deal with it. So, this was episode 5, childhood trauma, and I'll see you again for the next one very soon.